The wind from the ocean always carried the same smell: salt, rain, and a quiet kind of sadness. At the edge of the small coastal town of St. Clair stood a house where time had stopped long ago. It belonged to Alice Morrigan, 64 years old, gray hair tied back, hands that had seen too much work, and eyes that had seen too much loss. Every morning began the same. She woke before the sun, boiled water, brewed coffee, toasted bread, and walked slowly toward the room at the end of the hallway, a room filled with silence, lavender, and the faint sound of a breathing machine. Inside was her son, Daniel, 35 years old, paralyzed from the waist down since he was 12. A car accident had taken everything that day: his father's life, his own legs, and her peace. For 23 years, Alice lived on repetition. Every gesture the same, every word rehearsed. She became an expert at survival, not hers, his. She cooked, cleaned, helped him dress, moved his wheelchair, and smiled when he looked away. At night, they watched old TV shows together, the same dramas, the same laugh tracks. For him, an escape. For her, a routine that kept her from collapsing. Outside, the world kept moving. Neighbors moved out. Children grew up. Shops changed names. But inside that house, nothing ever changed. Until one night, it did. They were watching television, a rerun of an old detective show. Daniel sat in his wheelchair, a blanket over his legs. Alice reached for her tea, and something caught her eye. The blanket. It moved. At first, she thought she imagined it. Maybe the draft, maybe her hands were shaking. But no, it moved again. A small twitch, right where his feet were. Her heart skipped. Her breath froze. She didn't say a word, just stared, until the movement stopped. Then she looked away and tried to convince herself it was nothing. But the next night it happened again. And again after that. Always small, subtle, but real. She couldn't sleep anymore. She sat by his door in the dark, watching. Once, in the glow of the night lamp, she saw his foot shift, just slightly. Her heart screamed, but her lips stayed shut. Hope is dangerous. It can heal you, or destroy you. The next morning, she looked at him differently. He smiled the same smile, but something in his eyes had changed. They looked alive. She didn't ask. She couldn't. If she was wrong, she'd break. If she was right, she might lose her mind. That afternoon, while he slept, she took her old tablet, opened the browser, typed, "Hidden home camera." Her fingers trembled. It felt wrong, like betrayal. But mothers don't stop at fear. When love grows desperate, it turns into instinct. The next day, she went to a small store downtown. The young clerk didn't ask questions. She said it was for safety. Within an hour, she came home with 2 small cameras, one for the living room, one for Daniel's bedroom. She installed them quietly between books and photo frames, then sat in the kitchen, her hands shaking around a cup of cold coffee. "Forgive me," she whispered to no one. That afternoon, she drove Daniel to his usual physiotherapy session. He smiled at her before going in. He always smiled, polite, calm, fragile. While waiting in the car, she opened the camera app on her phone. At first, nothing, just an empty house, the light from the window, the clock ticking. Then, movement. Her hand froze. It was him. Daniel entered the room, grabbed the side of the bed, and tried to stand. Once, failed. Twice. Then again, and this time, he rose. His arms trembled, his body shook, but he stood. For 3 long seconds. Alice's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. He collapsed back on the bed, breathing hard, sweat on his forehead, but smiling. Her phone fell from her hands. For a few seconds, she couldn't even move. He can stand. My boy can stand. The words repeated in her head like a prayer, but then came the fear. Why didn't he tell her? How long had this been happening? Was he hiding it? From her? From everyone? She picked him up later that day from the clinic, pretending everything was normal. Dinner, small talk, soap opera. But the world around her was different now. Every time she looked at him, she saw mystery and a flicker of something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. That night, when he was asleep, she turned on the feed again. Watched him pull himself upright, watched him fall, try again and smile. There was pain in every move, but there was life too. The next morning, she couldn't hold it in. While they sat at breakfast, she said quietly, "Daniel, are you hiding something from me?" He froze. His spoon stopped midair. Then finally said, voice breaking, "I didn't want to tell you yet. I wanted to surprise you when I could walk, at least a few steps." She stared at him, torn between anger and joy. Then she reached out, touching his cheek. "You foolish, beautiful boy," she said softly. "You have already given me the greatest surprise of my life." Tears fell, hers, then his, and for the first time in decades, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a heartbeat. That night, Alice couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't fear that kept her awake, it was wonder. Because if her son could stand after 23 years, maybe God hadn't finished writing their story yet.
The next morning came with pale sunlight creeping through the curtains. Alice moved through the house quietly, careful not to wake Daniel. Her mind was still replaying the image, his body trembling as he stood, that smile that looked half pain, half miracle. She couldn't just sit and wait anymore. She needed answers, and deep inside, she knew where to find them. At the rehabilitation clinic, everything smelled of disinfectant and mint. The same nurses nodded politely, the same hallway photos of happy patients lined the walls. But this time, she wasn't here as the worried mother. She came as an investigator of her own life. "Dr. Grayson," she said softly when she entered his office. He looked up, surprised, then motioned her to sit. Her hands were shaking. I saw Daniel standing, with my own eyes, on camera. The doctor didn't look shocked. He leaned back in his chair, sighed deeply, and nodded. Yes, Mrs. Morgan. We've been observing some activity for the last few weeks. He asked us not to tell you yet. He didn't want to give you false hope. Her throat tightened. False hope? She whispered. He stood. Dr. Grayson gave a small smile. Sometimes the body surprises us. Sometimes the will does what medicine cannot. He hesitated, then added, You should talk to Rebecca. She's been working with him every day. Rebecca. The name hit her like a quiet echo, the same she had heard Daniel mention before. When the door opened, a young woman stepped in, red hair tied in a bun, white coat too big for her frame, calm green eyes. Mrs. Morgan? She said kindly. I didn't expect to see you today. I didn't expect to see you, Alice replied, more harshly than she intended. Rebecca didn't flinch. I'm sorry if I crossed any line, she said, but Daniel, he's been fighting harder than anyone I've ever seen, and he's making real progress. Alice studied her. This young woman radiated something she hadn't felt in years, quiet certainty, the kind of faith that doesn't shout. Then from the therapy room came a sound, a soft thud, followed by the noise of metal clattering. Both women turned and hurried down the hall. Inside, Daniel stood between two parallel bars, sweat dripping from his forehead. Rebecca rushed to help, but he raised a trembling hand. No, I've got this. And he did. He steadied himself, then looked at them, his mother and his therapist, and whispered, breathless, 3 seconds longer than yesterday. Alice felt something rise inside her chest, something too big for words. She wanted to fall to her knees, to cry, to laugh, all at once. Instead, she just nodded. That's enough for today, sweetheart. That evening, she couldn't help herself. She watched the camera feeds again. Rebecca was there, helping him stretch, correcting his posture, guiding his every move. Her voice was calm, gentle, and Daniel, he looked different, lighter, alive. He smiled at her in a way Alice hadn't seen him smile in decades. Not just gratitude, something deeper. She told herself it was just professional warmth, but her heart whispered otherwise. Each night she'd watch a little more, and each time she saw how Rebecca stayed after hours, unpaid, tired, but unwilling to leave him alone. Sometimes they just talked, sometimes they laughed. Alice felt torn. A part of her was grateful, another part, terrified, because she understood that something was happening, something she couldn't control. Her son wasn't just standing again, he was changing. A week later, Dr. Grayson called them both in for a meeting. He showed them the latest scans, pointing to faint lines on the screen. Here, he said, tapping with a pen. These neural pathways were dormant for over 20 years. Now they're active again. The signals are weak, but consistent. This is beyond what we could have expected. Daniel was speechless. Alice covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Rebecca's eyes glistened too, though she kept her professional calm. This isn't just science, Dr. Grayson said quietly. It's willpower. Afterwards, in the parking lot, Daniel stood beside his wheelchair, didn't sit, just leaned. Mom, he said, I want to try walking at home. Alice swallowed the lump in her throat. We'll make it safe. That night she moved the furniture, cleared the hallway, rolled up the rugs. And when he took those shaky first steps on their wooden floor, it felt like the walls themselves held their breath. Days turned into weeks. Daniel was improving fast, too fast, maybe. And every day Rebecca visited after work. At first, to supervise exercises, then to share coffee or just talk. Alice noticed the way his voice softened when he said her name, the way Rebecca lingered in the doorway when she was leaving. And one evening, when Alice walked past his room, I heard quiet laughter, 2 voices, perfectly in sync. Her chest tightened. It wasn't jealousy. It was the strange ache of motherhood, the realization that love could now come to his son from someone else. Later that night, she stood by the window looking at the ocean. The moonlight shimmered on the waves. She whispered, "Is this what it means to let go?" The next day, when Rebecca arrived, Alice met her at the door. I know you've been coming after hours, she said calmly. Rebecca froze. I'm sorry. I thought I should. Alice raised her hand. Don't apologize. Just tell me one thing. Do you care for him? Rebecca hesitated only a moment. Yes, she said softly, but I don't want to hurt him. I just want him to live. Alice nodded slowly. Her voice was tired but kind. Then don't hold back. He needs someone who believes in him. And maybe that person isn't me anymore. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She nodded silently. That evening, Daniel stood by the window as his mother brought him tea. She didn't say anything about what she'd learned. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that blesses rather than questions. He reached for her hand. Are you okay, Mom? He asked. I'm fine, she said, just proud. Of me? She shook her head. Of us. That night when she lay in bed, she didn't open the camera app. For the first time in months, she didn't need to watch. Her heart already knew the truth. Her son wasn't just healing. He was beginning again. And for Alice, that was enough. Outside, the ocean whispered softly against the shore, like it was agreeing with her, wave after wave.
Every morning now started with the sound of movement. Not silence, not the squeak of wheels, footsteps. Slow, uneven, but real. Alice would pause sometimes in the kitchen, just to listen. Each step felt like a promise fulfilled, something she had been praying for since the night of the accident. Daniel was changing fast. He trained every day, with a kind of fire she hadn't seen since he was a boy. He didn't just want to move, he wanted to live. Rebecca came by almost every evening. At first, to help him with balance. Then, just because she wanted to be there. She'd bring takeout, laugh easily, tell stories from the clinic. The house, once filled with quiet, now sounded like life again. One afternoon, when Daniel managed to cross the living room without falling, Alice clapped her hands like a child. He laughed and said, Mom, it's only 10 steps. She smiled. 10 steps more than yesterday. But that night, she cried quietly in her room, not from sadness, but from disbelief. After 23 years of pushing through the same hopeless days, she was finally watching her son return from the dead. Weeks passed. The clinic staff started whispering about the miracle case. Doctors came to see him walk. Some filmed his sessions for research, but Daniel hated that. He didn't want to be anyone's experiment. When Dr. Grayson asked how he felt, he said, alive and scared. Scared of what? Of stopping, of waking up one day and realizing it was just luck. The doctor nodded. Then don't stop. That's how you make luck real. At home, Alice saw the same fear in his eyes, the fear of losing what he'd only just regained. So she learned to do what she never could before. She let go. No more hovering, no more controlling every breath he took. Instead, she stood back and watched. And she noticed something else blooming too. The way he looked at Rebecca. It wasn't a secret. Not really. Love rarely hides well. One evening, Alice was making tea when she heard laughter coming from the living room. Peeking through the doorway, she saw them sitting on the floor, Daniel balancing without support, Rebecca holding his hands, guiding him as they laughed. For a moment, Alice's heart clenched. But then she saw it, the light on his face. He wasn't her broken boy anymore. He was a man in love. She turned away and smiled to herself. Good, she whispered. Good. The next morning, when Rebecca came in, Alice met her at the door with a small smile. I made extra coffee. For you. Rebecca looked surprised, almost guilty. Thank you, Mrs. Morgan. Alice nodded. If you're going to help him, do it all the way. no holding back. The young woman hesitated, then said quietly, "I promise." From that day, Daniel's progress became astonishing. He began walking with a cane. He could stand long enough to cook, to shave, to live like a man again. The day he managed to walk from the bedroom to the porch, Alice filmed it. She didn't plan to, but something in her wanted to freeze the moment forever. When he reached the door, the sunlight hit his face, and he whispered, "I can feel the wind." Alice dropped the phone, ran to him, and hugged him so tight he almost fell. They both cried, him because he finally could, her because she finally didn't have to. Dr. Grayson said that he'd never seen anything like it. He muttered, "Medicine doesn't explain this, but love might." At home, everything felt new again. Daniel helped around the kitchen now, though he was slow. Rebecca came by almost every day. Alice noticed how natural it felt, as if the house had always been meant for 3 people. Sometimes at night, when Alice couldn't sleep, she'd hear their voices outside on the porch. They'd talk about life, about things he'd missed, about the world that kept spinning while he was trapped in stillness, and she'd smile in the dark, because those voices meant everything she'd ever wanted had come true. Then one evening, Daniel knocked on her door. He stood there, in a clean shirt, nervous, hands fidgeting. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." He took a deep breath. "How do you know when it's the right time to tell someone you love them?" Alice froze for a moment, then smiled softly. "You don't know. You just do it, because waiting for the perfect moment is how you lose it." He nodded slowly, eyes distant, as if already planning. Then he kissed her forehead and left. That night, she watched from the window as he and Rebecca sat under the old tree outside, the one that had shaded his wheelchair for years. Now he sat beside her, no wheels, no limits, just 2 people and a quiet sky. She saw him reach for her hand. Rebecca leaned her head on his shoulder, and that was enough. Alice turned away and whispered, "Thank you, God." From that night on, everything changed again, not suddenly, but quietly, like dawn creeping through a room that's been dark too long. Daniel laughed more. Rebecca came earlier, left later. The house filled with smells of food, music, small talk, and for the first time in decades, Alice didn't feel like a caretaker. She felt like a witness to something sacred. Because healing isn't always about medicine. Sometimes it's about the moment someone reaches out, takes your hand, and says, "You're not broken. You're just waiting to stand."
The ocean looked different that summer, brighter somehow, like it was breathing with them. 6 months had passed since Daniel took his first steps across the living room. Now he didn't just walk, he lived. He worked part-time at the clinic, helping others find hope in their broken bodies. And every morning, before leaving, he'd stop by his mother's room and say the same thing. "Coffee's ready, Mom." Alice would smile, even if her eyes filled with tears every time. There was still a tremor in his step, but he didn't hide it. He wore it like a badge. Rebecca came by most evenings, not as a therapist anymore, but as part of the family. Sometimes she'd help Daniel cook. Other times they'd take long walks along the shore, her hand resting in his cane tapping the rhythm of the waves. And the house, that old, tired house, felt young again. One night, Daniel knocked on Alice's door. He stood there with a small velvet box in his hand. "Mom," he said softly, "I want to marry her." Alice didn't speak at first. She just looked at him, standing tall, shoulders back, alive in every sense. Then she nodded. "Then do it, son. Don't wait another day." The next evening, he proposed. Under the old maple tree that once watched over his wheelchair, Daniel went down on one knee. His voice trembled. "Rebecca Lawson, you taught me how to stand again. Now let me walk beside you for the rest of my life." She covered her mouth, tears shining in the moonlight. "Yes," she whispered, "1,000 times yes." When Daniel told his mother, Alice laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from relief, not surprise. She had seen it coming from miles away. The wedding was simple. A few friends, some music, the ocean as their witness. Rebecca wore a pale blue dress. Daniel stood without his cane, hands slightly shaking but steady. When she walked toward him, he whispered, "I dreamed of hearing your steps." He didn't wobble. He didn't fall. He danced. For the first time, Alice saw her son not as fragile, not as broken, but as a man who had conquered his own body and fate. She raised a glass of wine toward the sea. "Robert," she whispered, "your boy made it." The wind lifted her words and carried them away, like someone out there was listening. After the wedding, Daniel and Rebecca found a new home, a small white house closer to the water. They invited Alice to move in. At first she said no. She didn't want to intrude. But when she saw the place, the big windows, the smell of salt and sunlight, the laughter that filled every corner, she couldn't resist. Her room faced the sea. Every morning she woke up to the sound of seagulls and the smell of fresh coffee, Daniel's coffee. And every time he set the cup down in front of her, she thought, this is what peace feels like. She no longer felt like the caretaker of a broken man. Now she was simply a mother, loved, needed, and finally allowed to rest. One morning, Rebecca came into her room, her eyes glowing with excitement. "Mrs. Morrigan," she said, "we have something to tell you." Daniel followed, smiling wider than she'd seen in years. "Mom, you're going to be a grandmother." Alice froze. Then her hands flew to her mouth, tears, laughter, disbelief, all at once. "After all these years," she whispered, "life still gives." She hugged them both, feeling their hearts beat against hers. The boy she once carried was now carrying his own future. Months later, on a windy afternoon, the baby arrived. A healthy boy. They named him Robert, after the man who once taught Daniel how to fish and laugh and dream. Alice held the newborn in her arms, her fingers tracing the tiny hands. He smelled of milk and miracles. "You even smell like him," she whispered, and everyone laughed through their tears. Daniel stood beside her, cane forgotten, watching them both. There was pride in his eyes, but also something softer, peace. That night, as the family gathered in the living room, Alice looked around and realized something extraordinary. Every piece of pain, every year of struggle had somehow been rewritten into love. Years passed. Little Robert grew fast, running, falling, laughing. Rebecca still worked at the clinic. Daniel fixing up an old fishing boat in their backyard, determined to take his son out on the water one day. Alice watched from the porch, wrapped in a blanket. Her hair was whiter now, her hands slower, but her heart lighter than ever. She loved watching them, 3 souls moving in harmony with the sea. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and just listen. Waves, laughter, and that cane tapping softly on the deck, still part of the rhythm of their lives. One day, Daniel called, "Mom, come see him run." She smiled, her voice barely a whisper. "I see him, Daniel. I see everything." He came up the steps, kissed her forehead, and that touch, she felt it. The circle complete. Life had taken everything once, but now it had given it all back.
That night, as the sun sank into the water, Alice sat quietly in her chair. The house glowed with laughter and light. She closed her eyes, breathing in the sound of footsteps. Not weak, not trembling, just steady, full of life. And somewhere deep inside, she heard a voice. Familiar, gentle. "Good morning, son." Daniel didn't hear it, but he felt it, in the wind that brushed his face, in the calm that filled the room. The next day, Alice was gone, peacefully, in her sleep. They buried her near the cliff, overlooking the sea. Daniel placed her old coffee cup beside the grave, smiling through tears. "Rest now, Mom. You've done enough walking for both of us." Weeks later, while organizing her things, he found a small notebook in her drawer. On the first page, written in her delicate handwriting, were the words, "When my son takes his first step, I will no longer be afraid, because I'll know he can walk even when I'm gone. Every step he takes will carry my heart forward." He closed the book slowly, holding it against his chest. Rebecca stood beside him, silent, her eyes shining. Outside, their son laughed, chasing the wind. Daniel looked toward the horizon, the same ocean that had witnessed every chapter of their story. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel broken. He didn't feel lost. He just felt home.